Awesome. Good morning. Welcome to ShowMeCon. Just real quick, let's give a huge round of applause to Dave and Renee and rest of the staff that put this on. This is a big thing to put together, and they always do an awesome job. I'm very excited to be here. Again, my name is Matt Thelen, and today I want to talk to you about an approach to purple teaming. Now, keep in mind, this is an approach with many different components, and since all organizations are different, utilize the components that make the most sense for your organization. So keep that in mind as I kind of go through this with you today. I always like hearing the stories of how people got into the security community. And so I'll briefly share with you my little journey into information security. I grew up out in Jonesburg, Missouri. Anybody know where Jonesburg, Missouri is? Nice. It's an extremely small town. So small that when I was growing up there, we didn't even have a single stoplight. I mean, it's very small. But it is about 25 miles west of Wentzville. And anyway, so I graduated high school and decided that I wanted to go into the Army. So I enlisted as an 11 Bravo, which is an infantryman. And after completing basic down in Georgia, my first duty station was Fort Wainwright, Alaska. So, you know, not the southern part of Alaska, way up north. So I spent 3 years there, and then I told the recruiter that I would re-enlist if he could promise me that wherever he sent me, it would never snow. And so I found myself at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii for a couple years. A couple years there, I came down on orders to deploy to Iraq, and after a year there, I decided that, you know, sleeping in the mud, sand, and snow for 30, 45 days at a time was starting to get old. So I decided to get out and pursue a bachelor's degree in information system security. Unlike many pen testers and even some other folks in IT, you know, I didn't grow up with a Commodore 64 hacking at the age of 10, right? I didn't know anything about computers until I got into college in 2005. Luckily, my first semester in school, I landed my first IT job at a small consulting firm in Lincoln County, Missouri. Spent a couple years there, and then in 2008, I moved into a more security-focused role at a consulting company in Chesterfield, Missouri. With that role, I would go out to clients and do things such as business impact analysis, vulnerability scanning, some light pen testing. But what I found is, before I left the clients, I would be fixing Outlook fonts, doing printer support. And so it was in 2013 I decided to make the leap full-time into information security. And I moved to Enterprise Holdings, where I'm currently a pen tester. And over the last couple years, we put a lot of effort around purple teaming. And so what I want to present to you today is just some of the stuff that I learned along the way as we kind of put this together. And I do have to give some shout outs to my family. They're very supportive. There's been many nights where I was studying for a certification or prepping for a presentation. So very thankful for them. So I want to talk about what purple teaming is. I'm sure everybody here has heard purple teaming in some form or fashion. So I want to talk about what that is and how that differs from other sorts of testing. I want to talk about some considerations and challenges. So perhaps you have already got a purple teaming program stood up, or you're looking to stand one up. I just want to talk about some of the challenges and considerations you may face as you're doing that. Also a framework that you can leverage to do many things, right? Measure your coverage and depth of coverage, do things such as measuring your success. And then I'll wrap it up with some examples and takeaways. So what is purple teaming? So terminology varies across the industry. You'll hear things such as control tuning or adversary simulation. For the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to call it purple teaming. It seems to be kind of the most well-known term. But purple teaming is a function centered around communication between the red teams and the blue teams. Your red teams being your adversaries and your blue teams being your defenders. But it's a cooperation and mutual benefit towards a common goal, which is improving security posture of the organization. Now, most testing does that, right? If you look at any sort of security testing, almost all of that ultimately is there to improve security posture of the organization. But if you look at red teaming, it's more of an objective-based assessment to achieve a specific goal, right? You're looking at compromising a business critical application, or you're looking at getting domain administrator. A lot of times that testing's carried out without the blue team ever even knowing about it. You're going to have items such as physical assessments, social engineering. All those will be within scope of a typical red team. If you look at pen testing is generally smaller in scope. You're looking at testing, a web application or an API. It could be a network segment or even a mobile app. But the goal there is to find as many exploitable vulnerabilities as you can in the given time frame. And the reason to do that is to look at the true risk, right? When I got into pen testing and vulnerability scanning were pretty much synonymous, right? There were a lot of people in the industry that were selling pen testing services, but ultimately it was nothing more than a vuln scan. And so, vulnerability scanning is just typically that automated process of scanning against a database of known vulnerabilities. Well, going back to purple teaming, hopefully at some point in the industry we can settle on a term and everyone will know, okay, this is exactly what purple teaming is, or control tuning, whatever we want to call it. With the benefits, there are so many benefits when it comes to purple teaming, and just to name a few, there's an immediate benefit when just sitting down as one team. You're no longer working in a silo anymore. And it's no longer about winning or losing, right? It's about getting better. It's about increasing your capabilities, your creativity. And having that common goal can break down those barriers and make your testing much more effective. It allows you to carry out attacks in real time, which is great, right? Because now the blue team has visibility into how the red team operates. So there's that transparency factor there that you don't get with a lot of other types of security testing. It's more of an active approach when it comes to implementing tactical fixes, and it facilitates the sharing of info by creating that constant feedback channel between the teams to continuously improve security controls. And it also assists in evaluating your long-term security goals and strategy. Now, all these different sorts of testing play an important role, right? They're all key, but it's important to know where in your overall strategy to use them. There's going to be times when purple teaming may not be the most appropriate testing. Perhaps you go red teaming or you do pen testing. So while purple teaming is extremely important, and I think every company should do it at some point, keep in mind what the overall goal is, because it may not be the best approach, at that time. So let's talk about some considerations. So with resources, right? Staff is a big one. Now, I've seen a very successful purple team engagement with just one member of the blue and one member of the red. I think it comes down to more of like a maturity, right? Now, when I say maturity, I'm not talking about an extremely mature organization, right? When I say mature, I'm kind of pushing towards at least do your patching, maybe some basic scanning, some sort of monitoring. Now, even if it's just basic monitoring, you can leverage purple teaming to build out that monitoring, right? So if you're looking at standing up some sort of SIM, use purple teaming, right, to do that, because then you can make sure that as you implement this, that you're looking at the right stuff. So with the frequency, how often to test, there's a lot of variables that feed into that, right? And again, it's dependent upon your organization. Do you test when you get that new appliance, or when something big changes in the network? Or perhaps you're looking at just doing it more of a consistent basis, right? You're going to do it monthly, quarterly, semi-annually. Business is always a big one, right? Like a big key to success, like any security effort, is getting that buy-in from the business. If you can take your purple teaming efforts and align them to some sort of business goal or objective, you're going to set yourself up for success right away. And again, I think that from what I've seen, getting obviously the business on board early on is going to be a big key to success. And then lastly, just reporting. It's very easy in most cases, to write a technical report, right? You go in, And as a pen tester, a red teamer, you go in and you start kicking stuff down, and you write a technical report that outlines, here's all the stuff we broke, here's some recommendations for remediation, and then you follow it up with a whole bunch of screenshots of like shells and whatnot. The problem is, you got those recommendations in there, and management can consume that, give it to the appropriate teams, and hopefully that takes place. But if you can tell the business, or your management why it matters with the testing you did, again, that's going to set you up for success. One of the examples I like to use is exfiltration. It's very easy to go in and say, hey, we kicked some stuff down, we took some data, and we took it out of your organization. Everybody knows that's a bad thing, right? Nobody wants their data taken out of an organization. However, if you can say why it matters to the business, right? Taking that data out of the organization can have a detrimental effect on your brand reputation. That's the kind of stuff that's going to resonate with management, with IT leadership. So making sure you do that at some point in the report, the executive summary, is again going to set you up for success. So where to start is one of the biggest challenges that I faced, right? Do you start by reviewing old pen tests? Perhaps some audits. You go through and look at audits and you look for themes or, just big gaps, and you start there. Do you start with a big noisy port scan across the organization? If you decide to go that route, what network segment do you start with? The DMZ, the server segment, the end user segment. These are all things that can be a challenge and things that you also have to consider. And the problem with that approach is there's some structure missing in some cases, right? So you could do that. You can say, okay, we went through and tested a lot of these gaps that we exposed from previous pen tests. How do you measure that in a grand scale? How do you make sure that you have appropriate coverage during your testing? So coverage, that's a big one. Ensure that your testing has adequate coverage. That's a big one. With tracking, there's a lot of great software out there, right, for teams to collaborate. When I say tracking, it's more of getting the teams to communicate, right? Get the blue and the red to come together to create those test cases, to track any sort of remediation efforts, to expose those gaps and make sure they're actually being worked on. And then lastly, measuring success. When you look at like a red team engagement, again, a lot of times in red teams, one of the goals is to test the response of the Security Operations Center. So in a test like that, there's metrics such as time to detect, time to remediate. And a lot of those, that's solid, easy numbers to pull, right? Purple teaming, a little bit different. But here's how we tackle each of these challenges. So where to start? Look at the business need. What's the business risk appetite? And then feed that kind of into something like a MITRE attack. I'll get much more in depth on what this is, but it's an excellent place to start, and I'll show you why in a bit. It's also excellent for measuring coverage. And then tracking, again, it's more about just making sure the teams can collaborate, right? The blue team and the red team both have input into what you're testing. And then measuring success, attack complexity. And I'll go more into detail on what that looks like and how that works. But for this example, it's just attack complexity. Now that I've said MITRE quite a few times, let's go ahead and talk about MITRE for a bit. So MITRE was founded in 1958 as a systems engineering company working on national defense issues. They've added numerous technical and organizational capabilities over the years, and they're dedicated to solving problems. Right? They're maintainers of the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, which is CVE, which is a database of known information security vulnerabilities. They also maintain the Common Weakness and Enumeration System, which is a category for software weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Now, because MITRE actually runs a lot of this stuff, they have excellent insight into what these attacks look like. And it puts them in a perfect position to take all this stuff and create something as awesome as attack. So this is MITRE attack. It stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. So that's what the attack stands for. But it's a knowledge base of adversarial actions across their life cycle. So think of like APTs in the wild. Think of real attackers using real tools. You're no longer looking at indicators of compromise. You're actually looking at the behaviors of these adversaries. And that's huge, right? They also have 3 matrices. They got pre-attack, which sits to the left of delivery and exploit. That contains tactics such as, if I can move this here, target selection, people information gathering, organizational information gathering, adversary OPSEC. So think of like a lot of your OSINT stuff. That's what you're going to see when you're looking at the pre-attack matrix. Then you have the enterprise one, which covers the initial access and exploitation. And then lastly, you have mobile, which covers mobile devices. So if you look at that dark gray bar along the top there, it should look gray. Those are the tactics. Now there's 12 tactics. Those are the why. It's the adversary's tactical objective. It's the reason for performing that action. Now under those 12 tactics are 314 different techniques. Now, this is obviously the enterprise one, and it's kind of cut off. But out of the 314 techniques, they're not all unique. You're going to have some techniques. They're going to span multiple tactics. And it gets better. Within that, you have the procedures. So now we got the tactics, techniques, and now we got the procedures. The procedures are the exact way an adversary carries out or implements those techniques. And they're found in the example section of each of those. Now those numbers were accurate as of April when I created this. MITRE seems to do a lot of their updates, I think, on a quarterly basis. So this one does include the impact tactic, which is one of the big things that they added, which is got some really good stuff in it. But this is great for tracking efforts, right? To ensure that you have adequate coverage, as well as your depth of coverage. You can track this in things like Excel. A lot of people have done a lot of really cool things with Excel, pulling MITRE into it. The other option is Navigator. Navigator uses Node.js and Angular CLI. Towards the end of the presentation, I actually have a screenshot of what Node looks like, and I'll kind of walk through, or not Node, I'm sorry, Navigator. Some of the cool things that they have built into that. But one of the biggest things I think with MITRE is it provides a common language, right? The TTPs are comparable across different types of adversary groups using the same terminology. That's really big for the information security community, right? Now we have that common language where not only can we speak within our own security groups, but now we can actually reach out to other people within IT, even within the business in some cases, right? And so having that common language I think is a really big thing that ATT&CK brings to the table. So this is just another kind of view of enterprise, the framework. So you can see we have the 12 tactics there, and in the parentheses are how many techniques are available for each of those tactics. The stuff on the left happens earlier, so the things like the initial access and the execution, then it ultimately ends up at command and control, exfiltration, and then impact. So each technique does contain a write-up on mitigation and detection. So again, that is huge. Think about it. Going into any kind of engagement, especially a purple team engagement, when you can sit down with the defenders and say, here's the techniques we're going to go over, they can actually go in and look at mitigation and detection strategies. That's like a head start, right? They can now say, if we key in on this one system lock event, or whatever it would be, right? They can start doing this and pulling this in and immediately benefiting the organization by increasing the security posture. The one thing I like to call out on this is, and the reason kind of putting this slide together is, if you look at defense evasion, there's 67 techniques under defense evasion. That in itself kind of tells a great story, right? Why would there be that many under, one of those techniques, or one of those tactics? It's because companies are adopting better detection and protection technologies, forcing attackers to get more creative in how they conduct defense evasion. So that's kind of a cool thing to call out. So let's talk about an approach. So obviously you identify the team members. That's going to be the first key. Now again, you don't have to have a big purple team. right? Now, the more members you can kind of bring in, it's a balancing act, right? You could get too many, but if you could find the fine line of bringing just the right amount, right? Because you're going to add to the creativity, right? You're going to bring people's knowledge, from different areas and bring that together to create those test cases. If you're not that big of an organization, but you do have a red team and blue team, start with just one of each. So again, I've seen a lot of successes in that approach. And then choose a tactic or adversary. So the reason I have tactic or adversary, say you're an organization that's very vocal, right, on your political stance. Or say just by the nature of what your company does, you draw in a lot of APT groups, right? China or Russia or whatever it would be. Perhaps you focus more on looking at the adversary. MITRE has put together some really great adversary emulation plans that you can use to kind of test off of that. They also have a really cool page where you can put in groups and put in what your organization does, right, by sector. You could put in travel or banking, and it will actually tell you what groups are targeting you. However, like a lot of organizations, perhaps you're getting attacked from all kinds of people all the time. That's where I would say focus on a tactic at a time. One tactic, do your tests, and then report off of that tactic. Moving forward through the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to focus on a tactic instead of an adversary group. But keep in mind, though, that you can't do it by adversary group, which will outline the different techniques within the tactics to go test. So create the test cases and execute. So again, it's crucial that that both teams contribute, right? The red team is going to have what they think would be excellent test cases. They're going to go and create this stuff and say, here's how I'm going to attack this. The blue team is going to have just as good of knowledge, right? Because they know what tools they're looking at. They know some gaps that may exist. And so making sure that they go through and actually contribute and create those test cases is vital. It's very important for the success of a good purple team program. Now, execute. So this is an example of what it could look like. We kind of meet, we say, we're going to focus on this tactic, for next month. So you create the spreadsheet in some place where everybody can contribute, and you start throwing out test cases. You go through each of the techniques in that tactic, and you start creating test cases. And that way, on the day of the engagement, you go over, typically, the red team members, or the pen testers will go over and sit with the folks at the Security Operations Center, plug in their laptop, and say, here's the source IP of the attacking machine, right? You're communicating all this out to the defenders. You're saying, here's the target I'm going after. We're going to start with test case number 1, execute. You do that, you have the blue team sitting there looking at all their different tools, right? As that attack's happening, they're seeing this real time. They're saying, okay, I see it in the firewall logs. I see it in the system logs. However, over here, we lose visibility. So you can stop the test, see if you can implement a quick tactical fix. It could be something very small and easy. It could just be, a quick change in your SIM, right? To pull that information in to start getting logging and alerting around that. But identifying those small gaps, retesting and remediating, I think is important. Report and present. So, reporting. We all know how important reporting is. In any kind of security testing, the report is the ultimate deliverable. Not many people like doing reports, but we all know how valuable they are. And so, you put all this time and effort, right, into creating a great report. The reason I put present on there is if you have the opportunity to present to management, take it. And one of the biggest reasons why is, if you write the report and you send it out to management, they may just read it and they may give out to the necessary parties and be like, okay, cool, whatever. But if you have the opportunity to present, you'll be able to get feedback from them to make sure that what your actions or what you're doing around purple teaming aligns with kind of what they have in their mind. And so that could be a good indicator of, do I need to change my approach? Are they looking at testing all the techniques in a tactic? Is this too much for them to consume? And so, again, if you have the ability to go present to management, I would definitely recommend it. Remediate larger gaps and retest. The big thing here is don't stop at the larger gaps. it's bound to happen as you're going through your test cases that you'll uncover some small gaps. You'll be able to fix them on the fly and retest right then and there. And then realize, wow, now we have visibility on something that we didn't know. If you look at like red teaming or traditional pen testing, right, that process can take months, right? Because the testing happens, and then the report goes through where it needs to go, and then it eventually comes to the blue team, who will probably have questions on exactly how that was carried out. With purple teaming, no, it's right there. There's that transparency. With the larger gaps, when you uncover those, document them, report on them, keep moving, right? If you can keep going through the rest of the techniques in that tactic, then do it. If you can't, report on it and move to the next tactic. If you stop at those larger gaps, it's going to kill your momentum, right? Especially in pretty much any size organization. When you uncover something big, there's going to be some time to fix that. If you can keep moving forward with your testing, then I think momentum, again, is key there. And then increase your attack complexity. So as successful testing occurs, your attack complexity increases. It's that simple. Now, as you're going through and doing all this, you're building out a heat map, right? It's kind of showing like what your coverage and your capabilities look like, and against your controls. And then I just want to call out automate. So if anyone's looked at MITRE, they might have seen some stuff, or MITRE attack, you might have seen some stuff around automate. So there's some really awesome tools being developed. You have Caldera, you have Red Team Automation, you have Atomic Red Team. These are all great open source tools that you can leverage to automate some of this. Early on, you might just be able to automate at a lower attack complexity. However, each of these tools do have their caveats. So just like any security tool, ensure that you properly vet it and make sure that it makes sense in your organization. So measuring success. So attack complexity, right? We're not looking at time to detect and time to remediate, because when you're sitting down as one team with one goal of improving security posture, you're not measuring the SOC response anymore. You're sitting down saying, let's go through and see what we can fix on a low level, and then how can we increase our attack complexity. In this example, I have 5 levels defined. Perhaps for your organization, it makes sense to have 3 or 10. So again, it really just depends on how you want to define these. But again, as successful testing occurs, your attack complexity increases. So if you look at the first one, right, it's using tools out of the box with no modification. It's running port scans, being as loud as possible, right? It's the goal with complexity 1 is to be noisy, be seen, right? Because if you can't be seen with the most basic stuff, why try getting all elite and doing all the crazy cool stuff? So again, be as loud as you can, be noisy, and be seen. If you look at the second one, we're looking at like slight modifications of attacking tools. So maybe some slight throttling, changing of default ports, right? That's a big one for the second one. Jumping down to complexity 4, we're looking at actually combining techniques from other tactics to create our test cases. Now, if you're testing per tactic, you can still grab techniques from other ones, right, as you're testing that one. And you almost have to when you get to those higher attack complexities, depending on how you define it. But in this example, you would have to. And then going down to 5, extraordinary efforts are made to bypass all security controls. Now, if you look at this, it's extremely loosely defined. And it's like that for a reason. There's lots of room to continue to build this whole thing out each time you test a technique, because each technique tested has the potential to fine-tune that definition. If you define these early on at a very granular level, there's a chance you may have to not add to it, but actually change it. And if you're changing it, you're kind of eroding the benefit of a framework, right? And so I think it's very key to, at a very high level, define these. And as you're going through your testing, you might find ways to kind of fine-tune that as you go through it. And again, one approach would be, out of those 12 tactics, we're going to focus on a tactic at attack complexity 1 and go through and do all of them. If you're a very mature organization, perhaps you can do one tactic at complexity levels 1 and 2, right? So let's go through just an example with a test case. So in this example, we're going to focus on exfiltration. Now, exfiltration has 9 different techniques. Now, remember when I said where to start? is kind of the challenge. So say you're like, okay, we know we want to start with MITRE, right? Because there's some really cool things with MITRE ATT&CK, but you still have the 12 tactics with 314 techniques. So where do you start? Well, this is one approach. So if you look at the cyber kill chain, right, that far end is the actions on objectives. Some of the items in there, command and control, data exfiltration. So when you think about it, anybody that's been to like a SANS or any other conferences, there's all this talk on assume breach, right? You assume that someone's on your network and now you're just trying to find them. So a lot of red teams as well, that's how they operate. You know, everybody in here knows that to get that foothold, you just need a really well-crafted phishing email. Now, you can spend your cycles going through that whole exercise of trying to create that and establish that foothold. That is one approach. But if you want to assume breach, start with that far right side, which would be exfiltration or impact or command and control. The other one would be starting way left, right, that pre-attack. So if you want to just see what your company is exposed to in the outside world, you could start with the OSINT stuff. But in this example, here's some example test cases. So what's unique about the exfiltration tactic is the 5th technique down is exfiltration over alternative protocol. So what we did here is, in this example, we decided to pick a protocol. There's 4 listed in there, right? So we pick a protocol, we combine it with another technique to create that test case. Now, if you're testing against, say, a data loss prevention suite of tools, perhaps you call out a data type, right? So do you want to test what it looks like when credit cards are leaving your network, or just general PII or PHI? So in this example, what we did is we created, we said FTP over a standard port. Remember, this is a complexity 1. So we're looking at keeping a standard port. We're looking at being very noisy. And we're just going to do data compressed. We run through that test case and see what that looks like. Does the blue team see it or not? When you look at the second test case, we add in a couple other techniques, not to make it harder, but just to test those and make sure that whatever we're seeing is consistent. But you see we have automated exfiltration as well as data transfer size limits. And on both of those, we call out consistent size and consistent timing. The reason is, how many attackers are consistent through that stuff? Maybe some. A lot probably aren't. However, if you start, again, getting all elite and trying to make these attacks very complex, all you're going to end up doing is having a huge laundry list of remediation items to go after. That's going to kill your momentum. Management's going to be, probably second guessing, like, is this even worth doing? Maybe there's a better approach. So if you can, again, start small, start with what you know, right? You know that you have logging around something. Test that. Create test cases around that, just to make sure that you have that. Then you start increasing that attack complexity. But you can see we did stuff around, in this example, HTTP, we did stuff on DNS. But again, the goal with the complexity 1 is just be loud. Drop the hammer, and without bringing stuff down in production, of course, but just be loud and be seen. You can see this last technique here is just an example of one that doesn't require adding a port, right? It's just plugging a USB drive in to a machine and seeing what that looks like as you're trying to exfiltrate data. Now, when I said in some cases you can go through, and if you're, a more mature organization, perhaps you could do something as simple as, hey, I'm trying to do this FTP stuff, however, I just can't connect out over FTP. Perhaps there's some sort of security group or there's something blocking you. How easy would it be to just change that port number and then see if it works? Now you're at a complexity 2. You track that in a whole different heat map. So that's an example of something that's very easy to go after and test and say, okay, well, we could do it over a different port. Well, let's see what that looks like. How can we find indicators on what we can do to get logging and alerting around that to build out your capabilities, right? So let's jump to a complexity 4. Now, this one's going to be over credential access. And credential access has 19 different techniques. The thing that's interesting with credential access, and one of the caveats of taking this approach I'm laying out, is if you start at that far right side of exfiltration, you're going to hit credential access before you hit privilege escalation. And that can be a problem, right? Because just about every single technique under credential access requires admin or local or admin or like root access or system level access. how do you do that if you haven't even been to the credential or the privilege escalation stuff first? Well, I like to use this example. So, as a pen tester, a developer reaches out and says, hey, can you pen test my web application? I'm like, sure. They give me a URL, and during the information gathering stage, I uncover that it's behind a web application firewall. The first thing I do is I reach back out and say, can you whitelist me on the firewall? A lot of people throw their hands up and say, man, you're making me drop my defenses? Like, how fair is that, right? The thing to keep in mind is I'm not looking to test the efficacy of the WAF, right? All controls can fail at some point, right? So let's assume that all the controls failed and I can get all the way back there. My goal is to test the web application itself. So I'm testing the web app, whitelisted on the firewall, and I uncover, say, 5 exploitable vulnerabilities that are all high risk. Now bring up the WAF. Now none of them work. Well, what was a high risk is now a medium, maybe even a low. That's where pen testing will come in. The reason I say throw all that out there is with credential access, give the tester an easy way to escalate. You don't want them spinning their wheels trying to do privilege escalation on an endpoint to eventually get to this point. Give it to them so they can get through the testing and then drop it. Let's assume that the attacker somehow escalated privileges and I was able to get to this point. You want your defenders to be able to see what that looks like in the logs. Now, when you're at a complexity 4, you may not even be able to do, if you did complexity 4 across the board, you might be at a point on that privilege escalation tactic to realize that, man, we're kind of running out of stuff. That's where it's key too. So as you increase that testing, make it, easy for the tester to go through and just elevate those. Because you have a tactic around privilege escalation. That's where you're going to spend your cycles trying to figure out, how can I actually do this? So if you start from the far right at impact or exfiltration, keep that in mind when you get over to the credential access tactic. So looking at some test cases here. So this first one, account manipulation. So when I said at complexity 4, you're pulling techniques from different tactics. So that's kind of where it becomes key. But if you look at account manipulation, they call this a multi-tactic technique. It spans 2 different techniques. It spans persistence as well as credential access. So again, here we're just saying add a compromised account to a local admin group and gain persistence. So with credential dumping, if you look here, we're saying leverage approved software to dump credentials, exfiltrate and attempt to recover plain text. Right? That's a lot of stuff right there. But again, we're at a complexity 4. We want that visibility. If you look at the credential dumping technique, there's a whole lot of stuff in there. A lot of different tools you could use, right? If you have a decent endpoint or antivirus solution, because some of them actually do exist, right? Those tools are going to get ripped up real quick. But there's some stuff in there that could be approved, such as, sysinternals. Maybe you allow sysinternals. Within that is a tool called procdump. You can leverage procdump to then go dump your credentials, allowing the tester to say, hey, this is what this looks like using an approved tool. Not saying you have to blacklist that. However, let's build logging and alerting around what that looks like. So if someone does use procdump in that manner, we have that visibility, we can alert on it and figure out what's going on. If you look at hooking, so this is a technique that actually spans 3 different tactics: persistence, privilege escalation, as well as credential access. And this one is locate a tool that bypasses antivirus and execute a test script within the context of another process. Looking at bash history, we don't have a test case there. And I did this for a reason. There's going to be times where, as you're going through different attack complexities, you're going to realize that every technique may not be applicable. If you look at bash history, there's not a whole lot in there, right? It's a fairly simple technique. So you may only be able to test it at a complexity 1, but beyond that, there's not much you can do. But I caution you, don't write bash history off. As you create say something in Node, right? You're looking at your coverage map. Don't just remove bash history when you get to complexity 2 and higher. The reason being is, again, when you get to complexity 4 and 5, bash history might be something that you chain along with these other items that maybe were only applicable at an attack complexity 1 to build that high. If anyone's done some web pen testing, that's key, right? You find some low-risk items that have chained together in a certain way, now it becomes a high-risk item. So don't write items off if you can't find the right test case for that attack complexity. But going back to hooking, so another example. So hooking has one tool that's actually called out in the in that technique. The tool is called Fisher, and this is how it's defined. It's a government-grade commercial surveillance spyware sold exclusively to government agencies. If you got that tool, great, you could probably test it at complexity 1, right? But that's an example of you may not be able to touch the hooking technique until you get to a higher attack complexity. So there's also cases where you may have a technique that only has a complexity 1, and then you have to jump to a 5, right? So keep in mind, as you're going through this, you're not going to test every technique at every single attack complexity the way this is defined. You may find a better way to define it to where you could do that. So this is an example of Navigator, right? Navigator is an awesome tool that allows you to track your progress. Again, you could do it in Excel. This is a web version, right? They got a hosted version that you can go through and kind of mess with and see what it looks like, kind of determine like all the capabilities, what you can leverage, what may not work for you. If you're going to use this to track it, I highly suggest to pull it down onto a local system, obviously, and back it up. And again, it uses Angular CL, CLI, Node.js, and it writes all the files out to JSON. So again, it's quite nice. But if you look at the top left, we have a tab there, and that tab name is just called Attack Complexity 1. In this example, we'll eventually have 5 different tabs. The cool thing is, say that we went through Attack Complexity 1, through all the different tactics. Then we go over and we create a second spreadsheet with Complexity 2 through all the different tactics. You can open up a third tab by combining the first and second ones, and then send the colors however you want, and do an overlay. And then that point, you can see, okay, here's where we're at on a 1, but here's where we're at a 2. Look at all the red on these tactics right here. That's where we need to focus, right? And that's where you can build that story around it, present that to management, and say, no, this is really where we need to focus, right? We have great controls through Complexity 1 because, again, it's pretty basic testing. But through 2, we discovered that there's some stuff here we need to focus on. If you look in the right-hand side, you'll see that little gray bar popped out, or box. That's an example of a comment. So each of these techniques allows you to add a comment, which is great, right? Because this is something that you want the blue team and red team to both come together and collaborate on. So if you find a gap, you can write some stuff in there, maybe an incident number or something to track it to say, hey, here's kind of where we're at with remediation. And again, it's about transparency between the red and the blue teams. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, we have the legend. The legend, in this case, we have 3 colors defined. We have green, which is just showing that controls exist, right? We have yellow, that maybe additional testing is needed. And then red is gaps exist. Perhaps you add a 4th color in that's blue, and that's for techniques that are not applicable, right? So again, you want to make sure that you're able to track everything and not just leave it blank. So again, in some cases you might come up with 5 colors for your testing. But again, as you're doing this, you're looking for those themes, right? Those areas where you have some pretty big gaps. And again, that's how you can go to management and say, hey, here's this nice pretty picture with all these colors, but look at all that red. That's where we need to focus. And it does give you the insight into larger gaps. So just some takeaways. Purple teaming is not a silver bullet, right? So, but I think every organization should do it, right? There's a lot of really good things that can come about from there. Is it right for every organization? At some point, yes. But again, look at what you're looking to accomplish. Look at what your goals are, and then determine, is purple teaming the best approach? At some point it will be, right? You got to ensure that you're doing some of the basics, though. If you look at like the critical security controls, right? Do your scanning. Make sure you know what you have, right? And it comes down to like what makes a successful purple team. Just breaking down that barrier of communication. Just coming together as a team with that common goal. Sitting there together saying, we're going to go do this, and look at that. Our security posture is increasing after one afternoon. Some engagements might span an afternoon, some might span a couple days. Look at MITRE ATT&CK, right? Even if you have, you're doing purple teaming, you already have tools in place or some sort of framework, whatever it is, right? I would highly suggest just look at MITRE. There's so many awesome things that can be done with it. And in my opinion, I think it's one of the best things to hit the industry. It's great for purple teaming. It's great for red teaming. It's great for, threat intelligence. And you can feed this into a lot of things. And if you get on their website, they're using it in many different ways. So definitely check that out. Consider the different approaches. So does it make sense for your organization to start from the far left at the pre-attack and look at OSINT? Or do you just want to jump in and say, let's just assume breach. Let's start at that exfiltration tactic or the impact tactic. And, if we can at least start building up some logging and alerting capabilities there, you kind of started to win, right? Because if you can deny the attacker the actions on objective, again, you're starting to win at that point. And you keep moving back, and then hopefully you don't uncover anything, or maybe you do if you think that you may have actually been compromised. The other thing to consider is, again, do you do it by tactic? Do you do it by just a couple techniques in a tactic? Again, it comes down to a lot of different things, right? How mature your organization is, the current capabilities that your red and blue teams have, how creative they can be when they're coming up with these test cases. Or perhaps, again, you start with an adversary. Again, you could go to MITRE's website and go to the groups. So if here's a sector we're in, I kind of know some people that may target us, but maybe let's find the ones that are actually dedicated to targeting us. You can get that visibility, which is nice. And then business and reporting are key. Get that buy-in early, right? If you can get management buy-in and you can align your efforts around purple teaming, again, you're really setting yourself up for success at that point. And with the report, I can't stress this enough, because my management really opened my eyes up to how important this is. But reporting is key, right? Telling the business why this matters to them. Because if you don't, all they see is some technical stuff. They know they need to fix it, but how do they prioritize that with the other stuff, right, that they may have outlined in their strategy? So make sure you put it in terms that are friendly with business folks, because that's what's going to resonate. That's just what's going to surprise them and make them open their eyes and maybe their checkbook, So, that being said, what questions do you have? There's got to be a question. Not one? Yes?
Does that determine how much information gathering you're doing?
Yeah, so the question was, as we're doing red teaming or blue teaming, does that determine how much information gathering we do? It does. I think that, again, it's more in the approach and what your end goal is, ultimately. Next question? Yes?
The term attack complexity. Does a test case have attack complexity, or does a technique have an attack complexity?
Okay, so the question was with attack complexity, does the technique, or you said the test case...
Test case versus technique, like...
Okay, so if you're taking your test and you're approaching it by tactic, then each of those techniques you're going to have at the same test case. Now, in some cases, you may say that, we'll use exfiltration as an example. FTP seems pretty locked down, right? But DNS maybe not so much. So perhaps as you're going through that tactic, you outline all your different test cases, but one of the benefits to purple teaming is on the fly, you might say, okay, our 5 test cases around FTP are not successful, right? But let's go through and do some DNS stuff, and we uncover this. You go back to FTP, and you're like, what about a simple port change? And see if that works. So it's basically depending on the approach you take. If you do it by tactic, then as you build out your test cases, you'll do whatever attack complexity you want. But one approach would be complexity 1 across the board. And it does depend on your maturity. Again, if you have a lot of controls around some of those techniques, you may hit a wall from the very get-go, right? And then you're like, okay, well, I can't do anything else. That's where that creativity comes in, right? And so depending on how knowledgeable your blue and your red teams are, will kind of determine how fast you can actually move through the complexity levels. Next question.
How do you manage increasing your attack complexity with ensuring that you're not going to break production?
Okay, so the question was, how do you ensure with increasing attack complexity you're not breaking production? That's an excellent question, right? So that's where I think it's very important when both teams come together, right? So again, the red team might say, I can go after this, right? Say your target maybe is maybe not a business critical application, but it's something in dev, right? But ultimately that the login and alerting may look the same. And so that's a very delicate thing to manage. And that's where I think that making sure both teams can contribute is crucial, because then you have that ability to walk through that weeks or even months before you actually do the engagement to figure out, does this have the possibility of impacting the business? And so, just like any security testing, it just depends. And yeah, when you get to those higher attack complexities, it does increase the risk. So perhaps you pull it more into like a dev environment. As long as the same logging and alerting spans across multiple ones, then that would be one approach. Yes?
Are there public forums for other people sharing this type of information?
The question is, are there other public forums on people sharing this type of information? If you get on MITRE ATT&CK, again, there's so much stuff. If you go out there, you're going to see, and I think one of the best cases would be look at some of the tools people are using to automate, right? So the way I defined it within a complexity 1, you're pretty much doing everything in that technique verbatim, right? Whatever they say, whatever tool they're using, that's what we're going to use. As you get to the higher tech complexities, that's when you start kind of getting more creative. As far as forums, I would suggest visiting the attack site first and seeing, because there's going to be some links. There's some other good talks out there. Some of the key folks on the whole attack project have some excellent, webinars out there that you can look at, like with the whole groups thing, it was only a couple months ago that I started seeing that stuff around. And so, that's something that, I don't know how new that is. I never saw that. And so, one of the big things I do is follow attack on Twitter, which kind of helps. But yeah, as far as documenting, because again, it's purple teaming and you're not going to give too much information out about your organization, but I would start at the attack website. Yes?
So I come from a development background, and we always took the approach of not having much collaboration between testers and developers prior to testing, so as not to compromise the testing. So is there any of that concern in collaboration of red team, blue team, in compromising, the work they're doing?
Like the outcome? That's a really good question too. So say you're a smaller organization, right? And you don't have a dedicated red team, but say you have, 5 people on the blue team. You can do, now I'm not saying this is a bad approach, but here's the issue you could run into. So you're not big enough to have your full dedicated red team. You don't want to pay to have a red team come in. You want to do some basic testing. Find a blue team member who has got, maybe went through some pen testing classes. The problem you could run into is it's almost like playing a game, right? Like say you're playing chess by yourself. You already anticipate the outcome. You already know what's going to happen. You could run into that issue. But I think, again, with sitting down, as one group, because, historically we've always worked in silos. You always have your red team coming in, and it's almost like you're kind of fighting, right? If the red team can't do anything, the blue team wins. And then vice versa. And so again, I think that's one of the biggest benefits is just coming together, as one team with that common goal. And I have not really seen any issues of, someone saying, we probably shouldn't test this because I know that maybe this is broken. It's more or less, let's get some exposure out there. Let's bring this to light to get it in front of management, again, to ultimately improve the security posture. Yes?
As I'm thinking about red team and purple teaming, it seems like sometimes you want to do the red teaming to avoid the problem that it's nice that you're just talking about. Like, it's not a real test of your blue team if you tell them you're coming.
Exactly.
And then sometimes you want to do purple teaming because in a red teaming exercise, your blue team doesn't really have a chance to improve this. So it's like sometimes you should do red, sometimes you should do purple. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's very valid, right? There's times where penetration testing makes the most sense too. If it's just a web application, we want to find exploitable vulnerabilities in that. Of course, you're going to do, more of a pen test approach there. I think red teaming is key. I think that if you're very mature, I think red team, you'll probably get more from that. Because again, you do want to test the response. You do want to see, okay, what do these playbooks look like on the blue team as you're going through those exercises? But if you think about what the end goal is, say it is to compromise that business critical application, or just to see, if you want to look at, okay, what can we do with physical security assessments or with social engineering? Definitely red team. But if you're like, here's where we're at, we're standing up the SIM, or our SIM is here, and we want it to get to a maturity level down here, purple team that thing all day long, because you're going to be able to uncover gaps and then fix those gaps at a much quicker pace, right? Because it's coming up right there, the blue team sees it, and the blue team's able to leverage their creativity and figure out, okay, here's how we can gain visibility